Have you ever wondered who was Apostle Paul? Where is there so much writing and so much discussion about this one man called Apostle Paul? This is, can you believe it, whereby we dig into scripture to find the truth. We believe that all truth is God's truth, and it is our responsibility to share that truth with the rest of humanity. Who was Apostle Paul, and what do we know about him? As I've said, there has been so much talk and writing attributed to this great apostle called Paul. You either like him or hate him. I had a conversation with a Catholic priest some times back, somebody who had a very low view of Apostle Paul. In fact, he called him a radical. Well, that was his opinion of Apostle Paul. But like it or not like it, Apostle Paul is one of those people that you can't just ignore. He is one of the most prolific writers of the New Testament, and his travel or missionary journeys took him all over the Mediterranean region and parts of Asia Minor. These regions could include, or rather include, countries like Greece today, Rome, and modern day Turkey, a region that which included cities that he wrote letters to encourage believers in those particular parts of the world. Apostle Paul's background was of Jewish descent from the tribe of Benjamin, and yet a Roman citizen by birth. His Roman citizenship status gave him immunity over his mistreatment of Christians in his early parts or early part of his life. Apostle Paul proudly referred himself to as being of the stock of Israel, of the tribe of Benjamin, a Hebrew of Hebrews, and as pertaining to the law, a Pharisee of all Pharisees. He studied under the tutelage of one of the best Pharisees of all time. Gamaliel was his name. Apostle Paul topped the who is who list of his day. A brilliant man he was. The Bible reveals very little about Apostle Paul's family, immediate family for that matter. The book of Acts quotes Paul referring to his family by saying that he was a Pharisee born of Pharisees, meaning he might have come from a family of Pharisees. His family was into law keeping. You would say, or you could say, he was born into a family of powerful lawyers. Philippians chapter 3, verses 5 and 6 reads, I was circumcised on the 8th day of the people of Israel, of the tribe of Benjamin, a Hebrew of Hebrews. In regard to the law, a Pharisee. As for zeal, persecuting the church. As for righteousness based on the law, faultless. That we know of Paul, the chief persecutor of Christians. But let's dig a little bit deeper into who Paul was. What do we know about Apostle Paul from history? Or let's ask ourselves this question. What did Paul know about his history? He writes that he was from the people of Israel and of the tribe of Benjamin, a Hebrew of Hebrews. What did Paul know about his rich history? As a lawyer and a meticulous one for that matter, Paul must have dug a little bit deeper into who he was and into his family tree, I'm assuming. So I think Paul would have been familiar with his heritage. He would have known about his life, about the life of the patriarch Jacob, the father of the 12. He would have known about his great grandfather Jacob and the sad death of Rachel, his great grandmother, near the city where the Messiah was to be born later. Paul would have known about the loneliness of Jacob as he sought to comfort himself in Benoni by calling the name of his last-born child Benjamin, as reflected in Genesis chapter 35, verses 18. This last child of Jacob is where Apostle Paul's heritage begins. I believe that Paul would have known about his youthful days of Benjamin, the youthful days of Benjamin, the grandfather, the youngest of the 12 brothers of Jacob. Paul was definitely familiar with the famine that his family faced and the journeys back and forth into Egypt, and also the story of Jacob. These are the narratives, I believe, that Apostle Paul must have listened to keenly with intense and eager interest in his attempts to establish his own identity. He must also have known about the silver cup in the sack of Benjamin that Joseph and his aides must have put in Benjamin's sack. I'm sure that when he says of himself as being from the tribe of Benjamin, the youngest son of Jacob and Rachel, he is reminded of the survival of his lineage. Thinking about it, I wonder if Paul ever came to make the connection with the patriarch and the providence which brought the tribe of Benjamin to Joseph in Egypt. What is clear, however, is that Apostle Paul does mention that he was from the tribe of Benjamin. That's Apostle Paul. Some early Christian writers see in the dying benediction of Jacob when he said that Benjamin should raven as a wolf, in the morning devour the prey, and at night divide the spoil, mentioned in Genesis chapter 49, verse 27, as a prophetic proclamation of him who, in the morning of his life, will tear the sheep of God, and in its evening, feed them as the teacher of nations. Some Bible expositionists see that verse as a future prediction of Apostle Paul himself. I mean, Apostle Paul persecuted Christians to the highest degree early in his life, and later in his life, he blessed the church of Christ. But in my pastoral capacity or my teaching capacity, I'm not 100% sure that this verse in Genesis 49, verses 27, refers to Apostle Paul. I believe that during Apostle Paul's childhood, however, he still did not know who he really was in the grand scheme of things. He had not grasped the richness of his history. However, maybe he began to see things differently when he learned the words of the more peaceful prophecy of Moses about the tribe of Benjamin having to live safely, reflected in Deuteronomy chapter 3, verses 12. And this is how the text reads. About Benjamin, he said, "Let the beloved of the Lord rest secure in him, for he shields him all day long, and the one the Lord loves rests between his shoulders." End of quote. I believe that Apostle Paul's imagination could follow the fortunes of the sons of Benjamin as they went through the wilderness with Rachel's older children, the tribes of Ephraim and Manasseh, forming with them the third of the four groups that marched into the desert and resting with them at night on the west of the camp, as the book of Numbers chapter 2, verses 18 through 24 records for us. Verses 18 of that particular book of Numbers reads, "On the west will be the divisions of the camp of Ephraim under their standard. The leader of the people of Ephraim is Elishama, son of Amihud. His division numbers 40,500. 500. The tribe of Manasseh will be next to them. The leader of the people of Manasseh is Gamaliel, son of Pedazah. His division numbers 32,200. The tribe of Benjamin will be next. The leader of the people of Benjamin is Abidan, son of Gideoni. His division numbers 35,400. All the men assigned to the camp of Ephraim, according to their divisions, numbered 108,100. They will be set out third. Or in Numbers chapter 10, verses 22 through 24, this is how it reads. The division of the camp of Ephraim went next. Under their standard, Elishama, son of Mihud, was in command. Gamaliel, son of Peduzah, was over the division of the tribe of Manasseh. And then verse 24 of Numbers chapter 10 reads, and Abidan, son of Gideoni, was over the division of the tribe of Benjamin. That's a little bit of Apostle Paul's history. Apostle Paul must have heard how their lands was assigned to them in the promised country along the borders of Judah, as in Joshua chapter 18, verses 10. He's familiar with this history as an Israelite and as a Pharisee, a teacher of the law. This is reflected or in the Torah. So the scripture records for us the following: that's Joshua then cast the lots for them to Shiloh in the presence of the Lord, and there he distributed the land to the Israelites according to their tribal divisions. And there was an allotment for the tribe of Benjamin. The first lot came up for the tribe of Benjamin according to its clans. The allotted territory lay between the tribes of Judah and Joseph. So Apostle Paul is very familiar with how King Saul was chosen from the smallest tribe, according to 1 Samuel chapter 9, verses 21, the tribe of Benjamin. He was familiar with the time when his little tribe of Benjamin became the ruler of Israel. Paul's education included the fact that when the 10 tribes revolted, the tribe of Benjamin remained faithful, according to 2 Chronicles chapter 11 and 1 Kings chapter 12. I'm sure in his early life, Paul learned to follow the history of his people, even to the years of Babylonian captivity, when Mordecai, who was a Benjamite, had been carried away into captivity, according to Esther chapter 2. He was familiar with how Mordecai, his fellow tribesmen, saved the nation from extinction through the plot of Haman, the Persian Hitler. So instead of destruction, the Jews, through Mordecai, celebrated with gladness and joy and honor during the Feast of Purim in Esther chapter 8, verses 16 through 17. Such were the influences and the historical stories that credit Paul's infancy and teenage years as a young Jewish boy. Such were the early teachings under which his intellectual mind gradually rose to the realization of his position as a Hebrew child growing up in a city full of Gentiles. Paul states that he was born a Roman citizen as reflected in his own account in Acts chapter 16, verses 37. His citizenship, therefore, his citizenship status is the reason he can successfully appeal to the Roman emperor. The fact that his Roman citizenship is explicitly stated in scripture and was something that Paul used on occasions to his advantage. Paul was born in Tarsus, a free city of Rome, Acts chapter 21, verses 39. And it was Emperor Pompey who made Sicilia a Roman province in AD 64, and its capital named as Tarsus, where Paul was born. It is unknown exactly how Paul's parents became citizens of Rome, but we know that Paul was a Roman citizen by birth, a privilege which was not possessed by many. Some people could buy Roman citizenship, but it was so pricey. Look at Acts chapter 22, verses 28. But the privileges of citizenship explains how Paul has kept the flogging and the beatings as seen in Acts 22, verses 25 through 27. Paul was also able to appeal for a hearing before Caesar or before Emperor Nero in Acts 25 through 10 through 11. We also know with this, we know this with certainty, that God used Paul's rich background for his glory. And Paul himself testified that God had set him apart from his mother's womb and called him by his grace to be his servant. He writes that in Galatians chapter 1, verse 15. So, with his Jewish upbringing and knowledge of the Greek culture and the Greek philosophy from his time as a young man in Tarsus, Paul became the right person to minister to both the Jews and Gentiles through the Roman world. Paul's status as a Roman citizen by birth benefited him greatly as he traveled on his missionary journeys to fulfill Jesus' words that he would be a chosen instrument to proclaim the name of Christ to the Gentiles and their kings and to the people of Israel. So the scripture says this in Acts chapter 9, verses 15 through 16, that Paul was God's chosen instrument to witness to the Gentiles and kings and the sons of Israel. For I will show him how much he must suffer for my name's sake. And suffering he did suffer. Therefore, Paul was not only an influential person in shaping the faith of the early church due to his amount of writings that he wrote, but also because his writings are possibly the earliest historical witness we have of Jesus Christ. This has been Can You Believe It? We reflected on the life of Paul. Next week, I want to look into who was Paul and how does his theology and his philosophy influence the issue of women and leadership within the church. Women and ministry, can they be a part of ministering to God's people? A controversial issue, and I just want to touch base on what Paul says about that. Thank you, and be blessed.